Welcome to the final part of our 4-part lecture series on why capitalism is broken and how we can overthrow it. We launched this series because our society is in crisis. The pandemic has revealed our deep flaws in a neoliberal capitalist system, where together with the climate crisis, health crisis, economic crisis, employment crisis, each of these are demanding that we take a radical step away from the existing political and economic order. But of course, in order to change the world around us, we first need to understand it and how we actually got here. And it's only then that we can actually find routes to achieving radical change. And that is why we are here today with this lecture series. And that is with the help of our funders, the Federation of Young European Greens, supported by the European Youth Foundation of the Council of Europe. But this lecture series is only one part of our much wider political education programme. And to tell you a little bit more about that, I'm just going to pass you over to Rosie, one of our Young Green co-chairs, to tell us more.
Thanks so much, Jane, and welcome back, everybody. So lovely to see you all, and sorry about our hiccup and moving around, but thank you for joining us. As Jane said, we have got loads coming up as well, and it's really sad that whilst this is really sad, I can see in your faces the sadness that this is our final radical lecture, or I can sense it through the little black screens with your names on. That whilst this is sad, we are really excited that we will be next launching into a series of online talks and Q&As from a range of radical activists, campaigners, grassroots organisers, campaigners, policy experts, journalists, the whole caboodle, running on a weekly basis from now on. So this series has hopefully done what we aimed it to do, which is give us all a kind of foundational understanding of the big conceptual issues, the big problem and the big structures, as we're next going to kind of go down some really specific avenues towards different issues, and I hope that you can join us. But as Jane said, a lot of this has been with thanks to our funders, but we want to continue doing this work and continue building and building. So if you are able to help us do that, we would absolutely love it if you could add a small donation to our pot. We've got, for just £3 a month, this will help us grow our work to an unbelievable level. It will help us have thousands more people at these events through ads. It will help us run more events and get more activist trainings and talks coming through down the line. We have already upgraded to a new kind of tech package that allows us to have live transcription, which I think Jane will tell you more about if it's not appearing yet on your screen. So with thanks to your donations already, we've been able to do one of these 3 things. So if you're able to donate, we will hugely appreciate it if you're able to in these quite difficult times. But thank you so much, and really looking forward to this next lecture.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rosie. Great. So our lectures, as you know, are being delivered by the wonderful Sam Coates, who has spent many years managing major election campaigns, designing and implementing activism strategies, and helped to found a new political startup. And of course, he's been a Green Party county councillor and a former Young Green co-chair. So today, Sam's going to bring everything that we've talked about in the past few lectures together by explaining how this all can inform green politics. We're going to be talking about eco-socialism and social ecology, and why any environmental politics that neglects where power lies is going to be doomed to failure. After Sam's lecture, we are going to have a 20-minute Q&A. If you have any questions that you would like Sam to answer, please send them to me via direct message. You can see that my name is Jane, questions here. I'm going to collate all those and then they'll be asked to Sam at the end. If you do have any other technical issues, if you can send any problems you have, send a direct message to Rosie, who's got technical questions here next to her name. And that includes if you require the presentation in an accessible format. And if you require closed captions, then you will be able to see, you hopefully will be able to see down in the bottom Zoom banner at the bottom of your page, you should be able to see a little closed captions button. And if you press show field transcript on that, it should pop up. If that's not working for you, then again, you can just message Rosie and she'll be able to help you with that. Okay, without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Sam to take us away.
Thanks very much, Jane. I'll just get my screen shared and we'll get going in a minute. It's been massive fun doing these with you all, and great to see so many people here for the last one, despite me having to reschedule, unfortunately. I think we're there. Great. Okay. So I just want to stress at the beginning that I'm going to be going through covering off quite a few different bits this evening, and you might not all have been through all of the previous lectures, so don't worry. The slides will be available afterwards. You can check back to catch up with any of the previous sessions as well, so that all slots in, but I will be very briefly going over some of the key things that we did in the previous sessions. So for the final session, let's just move that out of the way there. In the previous weeks, we covered off a definition of what capitalism is, what the place of neoliberalism and privatization and so on was within that. We then covered up the changing state of democracy and how the kind of where power lies is obscured by the kind of how democracy looks in Britain. And last time we looked at people power and how it hasn't just been the elite that's decided history and getting some real inspiration from that. So tonight we're bringing it all together to envisage a radically just and transformed society. So I just want to say from the outset here that I'm not going to lay out a definitive map for changing the world to you. I'm not nearly qualified enough to do that, and I'm not sure any individual is. But I'm going to give you some tools to try and help you think about social change as a total system rather than only focusing on one area of change, like elections, for example, or direct action, and thinking about how it's all connected together. So throughout these previous sessions, we've introduced some really helpful tools for analysing what's going on in the world, the dominant economic system that shapes our lives and why it's broken, the political system we've inherited and why it frustrates radical change. But last time we looked back at, as we said, into history to see how change has happened despite those barriers. So today we're going to bear all that in mind, introduce a few more helpful frameworks to help us think about how we intervene in the world and working towards the overthrow of capitalism, but maybe not in the way that it sounds like. So we'll look briefly at some of the alternative systems we could aim for, but it's also important to say all we can do is see whether we're going in the right direction. There are no blueprints for a future society. We can only judge how far we've gone by how different it is to where we left from. So we can't expect a detailed blueprint. So the late theorist Eric Olin Wright, who I'll come back to later on, suggested that we think in those terms basically, but how far have we departed from what you might call capitalist political economy? So we can think in terms of, are there fewer areas of our lives that are dominated by capitalist economics, the need for economics to dominate everything else, and are there more areas of our lives that can be decided by an ethic of care or by pursuing freedom, for example? So that's one way of measuring how much progress we've made. So I'm going to kick us off with a poll then, if Rosie, I think, can launch that for us. So just wanted to ask you folks, particularly given the previous sessions, compared to earlier times in history, how tough do you think the task is ahead of us to stop runaway climate change and to build a better society? So is it easier? Is it tougher? Is it about the same? Or are you not really sure? So we'll just keep that open for maybe 10 seconds longer. Should we close that off now then? Okay, so that's pretty decisive, isn't it? People think that it's harder in the current circumstances than it might have been in the past to deal with the challenges facing us, and I imagine maybe that's partly because of the enormity of the climate crisis. But hopefully, we'll have some inspiration and some tools to help us think about how we tackle that challenge. All right. So I'm going to start by briefly rehashing some of the central concepts of the series so far. So we've talked about capitalism, which is the dominant global economic system that's motivated by the pursuit of private profit above all other considerations. So it's defined by the wage system, the fact that most people have to work to live, usually on terms set by capitalists, and we have to buy the things that we need in private markets in order to live. We can't sustain ourselves off the land, for example, in the way that previous generations were able to. And many thinkers would at least describe this as a state of unfreedom, or perhaps even wage slavery, even though it's distinct from the feudal system of formalized social relations that came before it. For practical purposes, we're still not as free as we could be, as well as all the hardship, poverty, and other domination that many of us suffer. And capitalism is defined by two main social classes: the proletariat, or the working class, and the bourgeoisie, or the ruling class, who own what we call the means of production. That is the factories, the mines, Facebook, platforms, all the physical or data thing that allows you to extract profit from something. So we talked about neoliberalism, and that's the modern variant of capitalism that exists in much of the world today. It was one of the two main forms of capitalism that emerged after the post-war consensus, or the truce between capital and labor after World War II, where workers were organized enough in much of the world to pose a real threat to the existing capitalist order. So compromises had to be made over things like working conditions, wages, and sharing the proceeds of productivity growth. Whether certain nations then moved from that system to neoliberalism, as we did in the UK, or a form of welfare capitalism that kept some of the previous elements, was largely a function of trade union density and power to enforce the continuation of those systems. So in neoliberal systems, we have three main features. We've got the privatization of the economy and public services, particularly things that used to be part of the state-owned economy. We have deregulation of things like workers' rights and environmental protections, and austerity, or the cutting of public services to public spending, to undermine workers' power to bargain with employers. So you're more desperate to take whatever job at whatever wage, because the alternative is worse. All this was designed to reverse the gains made by workers against capital since the Second World War, to allow the rate of profit to grow back to previous levels. But this wasn't just an economic program, it was cultural and social as well. We work in more fractured workplaces than ever before. People have more contradictory positions within the class hierarchy. So you might get a wage, you might be employed by someone, but your job might be to stop other workers from rebelling, or to ensure that they maximize the profit for the company that you work for. People are much more spatially mobile than before. So communities built on common class identities have broken down, like we might have seen, for example, in the coalfield areas of Britain. We're encouraged to get away from the working class and climb the ladder, despite this being a fallacy for most people and there only being so many positions in these hallowed upper echelons of society. And of course, that's even more difficult if you're a woman, disabled, of a minority ethnicity, and so on. So then democracy. We learned in session 2 that the UK state is an ancient hangover, unlike most of the modern government systems in the rest of the world. The Industrial Revolution in Britain came early enough that the emerging bourgeois class made an alliance with the older landed aristocracy to share power to stop workers from overthrowing them both. We touched upon the sophisticated intellectual class that in Europe was often calling for workers to rise up against the old regime, but in Britain was advocating for reform because of that alliance that we saw between the old aristocracy and the bourgeois classes. We saw a state that usually offered the minimum possible change to prevent all that revolution. We saw that with the slow way the vote was progressively granted to the middle classes, then working class men, then middle class women, and then all women in a very gradualist way, because it was just the minimum change that could be given at that time. And as a result, the concept of democracy we have in the UK, I would say, is pretty weak, not well understood, and is more about deciding which set of people will rule us at each election, rather than having a real say in the decisions shaping our lives, or even directly participating in those decisions. We're given a terrible choice within the rules set by elites that we have to take or leave, rather than being enthusiastic about anyone's plans for the country. The last time we talked about people power, we looked at the working class movements that might have overthrown the system in the 1830s and 1840s, and the fight for better conditions and trade unions. We looked at the women's movement that fought for first for the vote, and then for economic freedom from men, then for liberation from the imposed limiting role of wife and mother. We reflected on how change was often only achieved when there was a systemic threat to power. For example, the threat of revolution coming to Britain from the continent during 1848 or in the aftermath of World War I. We should also reflect on how, while oppressive systems like racism and patriarchy have their uses for capitalism, for example, being able to pay some groups lower wages or unpaid women's work, raising the next generation of workers, that system as a whole can compromise on social issues if there is a benefit to it. That's why we saw lots of victories for women from the 60s onwards, and it's also why there was a succession of progress on race issues and LGBT issues, particularly since the year 2000. And a couple more things to mention are that what we learned from the last session was that building organizations is critical to lasting power. And that's very clear in the history that we went over, beyond moments like the Arab Spring or Occupy, which really failed to bring about lasting change in many ways. Radical movements have not been afraid to polarize public opinion in the short term. We only have to look at the suffrage campaigns where there was mass burning of post boxes, arson, and all kinds of tactics like that from suffragists at the time. And leading on from that, radical flanks from the suffragettes to the Black Power movement have made the basic demands being made by a broader movement seem more reasonable to those in power, because the alternative is more scary. And that disrupting the profit-making process through strikes or collective boycotts, or making society difficult to govern through direct action, for example, is key to forcing decision-makers' hands. So looking at all that, what's the biggest challenge that we're facing today? The biggest challenges, rather. We still have an entrenched undemocratic political system, but we've lost many of the conditions that made it possible to win some of these victories, which is maybe reflected in what you folks were replying in that poll there. So we've got things like union density, so the proportion of people in a given workplace being members of unions has fallen. The aggregate level of union membership across Britain is lower, though we have seen rises since the pandemic, with some great cases of militancy in the pandemic, for example, from gig economy workers and from teachers as well. That's had 100,000 people on a Zoom call a couple of months back. You've got a situation where large bureaucratic unions are often captured by moderates that are not necessarily interested in grassroots power or organising the unorganised. And many unions now see their role as negotiating with the bosses on behalf of the workers rather than engaging them in actual building power. We all work in fractured sectors. We don't all work in big factories and so on. We don't know our colleagues well. We change jobs more often. We don't live in proletarian communities in the same way. So in a sense that if you lived in the rural region of Germany in, say, the 1910s, most of your life from work to where you went to the pub and so on was kind of within the auspices of the Social Democrat Party's kind of broader social institutions. And likewise in the South Wales Valleys near where I am, the kind of union determined many aspects of life. You had local health insurance that was organised through the union, miners' clubs and so on, that made it really possible to cultivate an alternative working class culture to the one that the mass media was trying to enforce. And on that, our mass culture encourages us to be individuals, consumers, and to grind for personal success. The idea that we can raise our collective standard of living through collective struggle is almost non-existent in mainstream culture. The socialist media that used to be run by the unions or the Labour Party, for example, have pretty much disappeared. And our opinions are broadly formed either by the media or by our immediate social circles. So for example, in my case, I would put down the fact that I kind of got into radical politics as being about the residual labourism and working class consciousness from my grandparents, where there was no kind of like active political participation, but it was like, well, we have this identity and we know who will look after us and who is against us. But despite all that, you know, all these policies the Tories are doing, so they're so nakedly not in the interest of most of us, aren't they? So why is it that despite the fact that governments are increasingly not working in most of our interests, most people are going along with it, or at least passively? So here we find Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony incredibly helpful. He was the leader of the Italian Communist Party in the interwar period. He was trying to work out why revolution had not happened in the economically well-developed Western Europe, but in backward Russia in terms of economic development. Writing in jail, where Mussolini had him safely locked up, he thought there were several structures that helped to defend capitalism from revolution. He said that the armed might of the state to crush revolution, like what happened here in Britain in the 19th century when the Chartists were planning for that, was only a last resort in the modern era, and that there are a whole host of institutions that help reproduce the ideological justifications for capitalism, from the education system to the media to religious institutions, and so on and so on. So this idea that bourgeois culture, so culture produced by and for the purposes of those that own the means of production, makes the masses either think that capitalism is in your best interest, so rising GDP, rising profits is not only good for the bosses, it's good for everyone. It can make you think that, or that crucially the alternatives aren't possible, as we talked about in the first session when we talked about the concept of capitalist realism. Just the idea that change is possible had been attacked after many decades of attacking working class organization. So this is what he meant by hegemony. When people don't earn very much, vote Tory because they're convinced Brexit will make the UK better, that's hegemony. The result of a set of institutions that shape the way that we see the world. So whenever we come across people like that, let's not get angry. Let's understand that how people's opinions are formed are, very, very systemic in that way. In the UK, we're fed ideas like other people are selfish and would ruin attempts at a better society, that there is limited money to look after our basic well-being, like the NHS and so on, and so on and so on. But those ideas can only hold while people are atomized and alienated from other people, and alternative sources of knowledge and leadership are not forthcoming. So Russia, as a relatively backward society in 1917, didn't have these backup institutions, and the peasants and workers were able to clearly see where their interests lay when organized revolutionaries went around and got people talking about these things. So Gramsci said that the final push for revolution can only take place when the left has already built an alternative culture that's hegemonic enough to support that revolution. So in advanced societies, you have two things. You have a war of position, which is building an alternative culture and institutions to challenge capitalist ideology. And then you have a war of maneuver. So if you think about 1917, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in Russia and physically took over the state. That's not how things would work today for all kinds of reasons, and it's not a strategy I would ever advocate. But the final overthrow of capitalism or the revolution takes place once you've already become hegemonic in terms of the popular culture and imagination, so that once you have some power, you will actually be supported. So how do we break this hegemony of the right down? We don't subscribe to these ideas, largely because of our social connections with other activists or things we read or the activities we do together. But our best bet is to actively work to bring more and more people into these networks and to support the growth of institutions to reproduce these ideas. This means building alternative media, for example, but also really means basic community projects that show people the power they have when they work together. We'll come back to the how of that towards the end. So what sort of world do we want exactly? What does all this have to do with green politics? So centrally, the continued dominance of capitalism is going to mean that we smash through the buffers of environmental limits. The pursuit of endless profit and growth is built into that system, both in terms of the need to increase GDP, in terms of the need for profits to accumulate, and the ever-increasing exploitation of natural resources that's hardwired into the system. So when we as Greens say that the pursuit of growth at the expense of everything else is destructive, we should not obscure the fact that it is capitalism itself that is driving that dynamic. That should shape how we go about our strategy for tackling the climate crisis. And it means that we should use non-market solutions to solve this thing. We'll come back to that. So a pro-planet politics is necessarily an anti-capitalist politics. And this process is driven by a very small proportion of the global population. Most of us are merely forced to live within that framework that shapes society. So on our way to a better society, weakening the power of capital has to be a central aim. And that includes solving the climate crisis. So I want to briefly outline some of the dangers of an environmental politics that doesn't include a sensitivity to class politics and all the tools that we've been going over through this series so far, to the essential solidarity between all peoples, regardless of how we look, how we are, or where we are in the world, and one that in general doesn't consider all of the structural factors we've talked about during this series. Firstly, we see a fringe movement that says that population is the driver of environmental collapse, with all the inevitable racist and colonial implications that are kind of wrapped up in that. Despite it being obvious that the impact on the environment is a function of population multiplied by consumption, if you just look at the fact that the poorest half of the world's population contribute just 10% to global emissions. This is an environmentalism whose solidarity ends at the border posts. It takes no account of how Western tastes and economic power drives ecological destruction in the global south, particularly in the tropics for things like coffee, beef, or palm oil. It diverts the blame from the hyper-consumption of the super rich to the people that are often working in horrendous conditions in these parts of the world to satisfy Western tastes. A theorist called Andreas Malm has identified a distinction between what he calls subsistence emissions and luxury emissions, and the fact that luxury emissions are not necessary for staying alive. So under this conception, it's important to see that there are people in the world using peat fires in slums, for example, or gas stoves to keep warm and to cook food. It's not about what fuel they're using, it's about what it's being used for. Those are just emissions because they're keeping people alive. On the other hand, SUVs, private jets, and other things should be seen as unjust and should be targeted for reduction first. And if we look at what solutions unrestrained capitalism is finding to the climate crisis, so if we're thinking about trying to solve the climate crisis through the current system, this gives us hubristic attempts to colonize Mars, disaster bunkers in New Zealand, and fuel taxes in France that target ordinary workers. We can see why capitalism is not up to the challenge of solving the climate crisis. And Shell, the oil company, just got planning permission to built a huge offshore wind farm off the North Wales coast a few weeks ago. And I just find that disgusting that the proceeds of that project are going to an oil company, the kind of company that needs to be shut down, rather than that money being used to fuel further decarbonisation efforts, or the local communities being given those proceeds in order to adapt to flooding, for example. That's what happens when we try to solve it within the status quo. And there's also a focus on individual consumer behavior instead of the systems that force us to live our lives in destructive ways. One example I wanted to bring up that I think described a weakness that the Greens sometimes have with these things, I think it's a useful case study really, is there was recently a media release reacting to the falling profitability of oil companies, where the shift towards renewables is implied to be almost an unstoppable natural occurrence because of the growing market in renewable energy, rather than a far from certain result of dedicated global campaigning, as well as saying that workers who are in these damaging industries need retraining rather than being guaranteed a well-paid union job. And I think that shows a blind spot that needs to be worked on if we're going to be properly conscious about where power lies and who benefits from these changes. We need to be co-producing these solutions with workers like that. Just coming back briefly to the individual consumer point, people often talk about this disease of consumerism, which is about greed and for which we are all individually responsible, but we don't hear enough about how our society is designed around high consumption, old leaky homes or patchy, unreliable public transport, and endless propaganda telling us that buying more stuff is what will make us happy. And finally, it's worth thinking more deeply about the state. And we've talked about the fallacy of winning the keys to Westminster, that you don't need to build ground level power, all you need to do is win an election. And just as Labour has been afflicted by that, they just need to win an election to implement their agenda. We need to think very carefully about that. So if the Green Party had a position in government, for example, and wanted to implement the shutdown of the carbon economy, who will resist that and how? Who will support us and how strong are they compared to our opponents? So some important considerations for how we go about our politics then. So what exactly is this radically transformed society that we want to see? What does it look like? We share a pretty broad agenda, as Greens I would say. We want to abolish the systems of oppression that dehumanize women, people of color, LGBT plus people, and disabled people. We also want men to be free from the narrow forms of behavior and expression that patriarchy enforces and polices. We don't want anyone to be deprived of the basic needs of survival, food, shelter, healthcare, human connection, because of the vagaries of an economy that's built for us to serve it rather than the other way around. We want to stop the destruction of the living systems that make this planet habitable for us. But whilst there's an overwhelming short-term need for a warlike mobilization to wean society off of fossil fuels, the values underlying what society we want to aim towards will determine how we go about that job as an emergency, won't it? And we know that societies that call themselves communist replace one form of oppression with another, unfortunately. Instead of serving a ruthless capitalist logic, people had to follow the whims of vast bureaucracies that also devastated the environment and abused people's human rights. So in many ways, people were no freer in those societies than you would be in a capitalist society. So just briefly in the chat then, other than dealing with blowing the carbon budget, paint a picture for me of like how would you experience life differently in this radically transformed society that we want to see? How would it be different for you? Let's just give a few moments for people to enter a sentence there in the chat if we can enable that. I think the chat's enabled. More cycling and public transport. Everyone be more equal, yeah, great stuff. No money, nice. Mutual aid, sharing skills and resources, nice. UPI. Dealing with inequality. Shorter working hours, essential, yeah. Green spaces, happier people, less inequality. Better mental health, horrifically neglected issue, particularly at the moment. Fully funded healthcare, better democracy. More environmentally friendly options that everyone can access, not just middle class people. That's a really important one there. Okay, thanks, folks. I think that kind of demonstrates a lot of the kind of commonality of vision that we have here. So let's move on. So as I said, how we imagine our end goal will influence how we try to solve the immediate crisis. So I think it's actually quite important to not only say our politics needs to avoid these pitfalls that we've just talked about, but also kind of what's the direction that we want to go in. And I'm going to talk a bit about two possible futures, positive ones in my view. There's other dystopian directions society could absolutely go in if we don't intervene in it. But these are eco-socialism and social ecology, which is perhaps less well known, but really worth spending a bit of time on. So eco-socialism, firstly, for me, this is the only form of green politics which accepts the reality that oil companies are not going to put themselves out of business. We can't use market incentives to stop them from emitting enough CO2 to break the barriers that we have. Stopping runaway global heating will involve a historic confrontation with powerful sections of capitalism, for example, the fossil fuel industry. And yeah, eco-socialism is the one for me that recognizes the reality of that. So it's a belief that saving the planet involves class struggle, not commodified carbon quotas. It demands we use the states to directly intervene and create the changes needed, or that's certainly at least what we should be demanding. The actual route we take really depends on how things go over the next few years. And democratic economic planning and, the economy should be planned democratically rather than on the basis of, who owns the wealth. So very much taking private sector means of production and communalizing or putting those to the common good. And economics is planned for the provision or for the good of both people and the planet rather than profit. And a really important aspect of eco-socialism for me is the revival of the commons. Now, some of you might have been to a talk that Derek Wall did to the Young Greens last year now, which I think was about the commons and eco-socialism. It was a great talk, and Derek did a really good piece on Bright Green recently that kind of touched on some of these aspects. But it's the idea that we in the first week, in the first session, we talked about how before industrialization in Britain, there was a tradition of common land where you had these areas of land that were not really owned by anyone as such, where by virtue of living in a certain place, you had the rights to either graze animals or to grow crops on this land for yourself. And you worked and you cooperated with the rest of the community to look after and make sure that these resources were not overexploited and that they were sustainable. And for eco-socialism, bringing that element of the economy and resources back is a really important thing. And it's not just how we use land, and crucially, if we thought about land and resources in this way, it creates an extra safeguard where if you just nationalized things, a future government might be able to just sell them off to the private sector, again, like we saw in the 70s and 80s, whereas if it's controlled directly by the community, you can't really do that. But we do have examples of commons like Wikipedia, where no one makes any money out of it, that is completely done by volunteers writing articles and peer reviewing them. So we do have 21st century examples of it. So it is a variation of kind of traditional socialism, and it uses its power to address the immediate ecological crisis through the state. And when I first read Naomi Klein's book a few years ago, This Changes Everything, I'm not even sure it uses the word eco-socialism actually, but it's amazing how much it doesn't use theory, it doesn't do anything dry, it just talks about the severity and the immediacy of the climate crisis and how capitalism is not up to solving this. We need to use the state to directly intervene in these things, to nationalize the oil companies, to shut them down, to use their assets to try and reverse the damage. And that it's actually an opportunity, climate change, in that the right knows that climate change cannot be actually solved by maintaining the status quo, so that we have, because it's a matter of life and death, we can use this crisis to provide a better society for everyone. And there's never been a better time for it. So, as I said, eco-socialism is a slight variation on kind of classical socialism. For most of left thinkers these days, it's actually pretty incorporated into the mainstream of socialism. But it's worth pointing out that there's been controversies in the sense that a lot of Latin America's had leftist governments since the 2000s, where they have been, they've proclaimed socialism. They've done very good redistributive policies that have reduced poverty really dramatically, but they pursued a route to do that that you might call like extractivism, where they were taking advantage of high oil prices, high market prices globally for other natural resources they had, to sell those resources globally, to use the profits to fund national infrastructure and to reduce poverty, but increasing their reliance on that model, and crucially getting into battles with indigenous peoples that did not want these resources to be exploited and land to be exploited in this way. So it is still a live debate within kind of socialist thought, and it does affect what route you take to solve social problems. And in that context, I think it's very noteworthy to say that I had a look a couple of weeks ago at the Green Party's 2019 manifesto, and it's really interesting that, as far as I could see, the main tool to decarbonize the British economy was a carbon tax. And that struck me as a bit odd, as opposed to like direct state involvement by nationalizing and energy and just doing the transition directly in collaboration with local communities, because taxes can be distorted, they can be weakened to the point that they don't solve what they're designed to solve, like the EU emissions trading scheme, for example, which has not had any real impact on reducing CO2 emissions. So within green circles, people sometimes talk about the need perhaps for degrowth. So eco-socialism is not particularly interested in this, I would say. It's more about what sort of economic activity exists and what material resources are being used to create that economic activity. And a big part of the eco-socialist critique of capitalism is it actually creates huge amounts of waste that is bad for the environment through things like cost cutting, global production systems where things could be made locally, and competing between companies where you actually supply more of something than is needed to satisfy social need. And like a great example of kind of people who are trying to build eco-socialism on the ground is Cooperation Jackson, which is a quite long established project now in Jackson, Mississippi, where the Black community there just decided at one point, this place is not being governed in our interests. So they've set up a kind of cooperative economy. There's like a coalition of different employers. It's both trying to deal with local environmental problems, but also to reduce the reliance of the Black population locally on kind of the capitalist economic system to try and build some element of self-sufficiency by working together. So there'll be some links in the further resources about that I'd really encourage you to check out. So if you want to learn more about that, read that book by Naomi Klein, and Bright Green also has a really great guide to eco-socialism that we'll include in the bits later on, the further bits. So on to social ecology. Now, this is more of an evolving practice than a solid ideology in the way that eco-socialism is, perhaps. So this school was founded by Murray Bookchin from the 1960s onwards, and it aimed to combine green politics with an anarchist critique of centralized socialist bureaucracies at a time when the scale of environmental damage was first really being understood. So it was a really reaction against kind of the Bolsheviks in Russia that had used top-down hierarchical systems, both to take power, but also to run the society where people were not really very free. So it's focused on abolishing domination and hierarchy in all its forms. So whether that's men collectively dominating women, the rich global north dominating the south, the capitalist ruling class dominating everyone else economically, and so on. It also relates, it's got quite a philosophical bent, and it relates the way that humans dominate the planet to the domination of each other. And some of these theorists will say that societies with lots of kind of very unequal, domineering societies also tend to do more damage to the natural world, which I thought was really interesting. And the idea that the environment is expendable is kind of linked to the logic that some nations or peoples are expendable, and it's that kind of social mentality that allows both of those things to happen. So, you know, geoengineering that blocks out the sun in order to enable capitalism to carry on going is kind of a logical outcome of that sort of mentality, isn't it? And it also emphasizes how humans can learn from the way that the natural world works and to try and apply that to our own society. So even though pop science is all kind of like Darwinism and only the fittest will survive, there's actually a huge amount of symbiosis and mutual aid within natural systems, whether it's bacteria and soil, whether it's the kind of relatively recently discovered fungal networks between forests, for example, and there's not ruthless competition going on within nature. And yeah, what's interesting about this is that it's quite utopian. It's quite you know, it's not something you can imagine moving to next year, is it? But many of the principles have been applied to the Democratic and Federalist Society in Rojava in Kurdistan. So the Kurdish people have never had a state. They've straddled Syria, Iraq, and other countries. And for many years, the kind of Kurdish liberation movement was focused on winning a state for itself, often through armed struggle. But at one point, the leader of that movement discovered these ideas of social ecology and then invented this concept called democratic confederalism, where you don't try to win a state, actually. You build kind of a non-state that's just based on thick social movements and social relations between people that exist within another state. So the Syrian state, for example, is not very present within that part of Syria, which allows people to operate in this way. But if they try to have borders, they might have more of a problem. And you know how this society works is you have confederated communities of autonomous communes that operate direct democracy over major decision making, democratic economy. Feminism is very important. There's women's protection, armed women's protection units, cultural and religious plurality in a way that's quite rare in that part of the world. You know, there's based on the ideas of equality of all people. So practically, you can start building this at a local level through things like popular assemblies and direct democracy, and building cooperative economies that kind of builds that practice of relating to each other and building collective power. So it can be started on a very small scale, and they're very useful ideas to think about how we can incorporate these ideas into our campaigns and into our social movements, because that will then influence the direction that those take. If we have hierarchical top-down campaigns, then if they're successful, the society that emerges from that is going to have those same things, isn't it? So I just wanted to use a couple of charts then to describe the difference between these two ideas. So if you think about society as focused on three poles, you have the economy and economic power. So in a capitalist society, the economy bit of this tends to dominate the other two things. It influences civil society and often controls the state. The state is what it says on the tin. It's the kind of organized institutions of the country. And civil society or social power is kind of the organized mass of the population as a whole. So by building out that section, you're trying to really make sure that the actual views of the majority are reflected both in the way that the economy works and the way that the state works as well. And social ecology is, so whereas eco-socialism is very much focused, I would say, on civil society controlling the state in order to control the economy through the state, social ecology, you don't really have a state in the traditional sense. Civil society is very thickly organized. It controls the economy directly, but then civil society federates between different communities and comes together. So, you know, two countries that share a river valley, for example, might form a federation where, on the basis of common principles, they will decide together how to manage that resource. But the democracy flows upwards. So it's not people electing national politicians that make all the big decisions. It's communities using popular assemblies to send delegates that go and argue for those decisions that have been made at a lower level. So really the end goal of social ecology is self-governing communities that use direct democracy, but federate with other communities for shared goals and principles. So we talked about Rojava, talked about what it can be practically. So there's something that we can start building now where we are for the purposes of winning some of the emergency changes we need. And the idea, if we can, in time, organize whole societies without hierarchy or domination, is something that's quite attractive to me. Be keen to hear what you folks think in time. And if you want to, as I said, that's quite a complex thing. If you want to learn more about it, there's a highly comprehensive podcast introducing that on the Seriously Wrong podcast, which I will include in the notes. And, you know, my personal view then on kind of the trajectory of society is that we probably need something that resembles eco-socialism to solve the very immediate crisis, to turn off the carbon taps and make sure that everyone's needs are provided for whilst we dismantle the fossil economy. But that in time, it'd be great to be working towards social ecology, where we kind of work more in harmony with the natural world as a whole, and really do some hard work on abolishing those other forms of domination within human society. So how do we move towards that world? What do we need? Now, talking about this in context of the Green Party, so I wanted to stress that, yes, elections are important, but they're not nearly enough to transform society. We need to think about all of these things in a totality. So I would be posing questions like, how does the wider environment affect our ability to win elections? Do the kind of people that already support the Greens have enough money to give, for example? Does the media system allow the party to get its message out far enough? Why, when the policies are so popular, are we still doing so badly in the polls? You know, there's there's things other than what we do in an election campaign to influence that. And once you get elected, how does that broader environment affect what is actually possible to do? So it's been mentioned that I was on Oxfordshire County Council for a few years, and because of the way that that council was structured, where there was a cabinet making most of the major decisions, and where there was just this kind of social political culture where the other opposition parties were quite happy to let the Tories run the council and then criticise them, rather than really attempt to build some alternative coalition that would work quite differently, which is what we were proposing. So yeah, got elected, didn't think too much about how to exercise that power, and yeah, found it quite difficult, to be honest. And you know, a great way of thinking about all these structures we've been learning about throughout this series is looking at the Corbynism, and that it should be a really cautionary tale for us, really. So, you know, Corbyn got elected in 2015. He seemingly had so many advantages. There was an exhausted centrist leadership with no new ideas for the changed reality after the financial crash. They were out of ideas. And then the Corbyn movement had 500,000 members who were able to go out and talk directly to voters. And they had an alternative participatory model of politics that included democratizing the party so that you could get rid of those hierarchies. And of course, there was a hugely popular policy platform, while the Tories were just offering more pain and austerity. But some of the problems were that, you know, the Labour Party had no the Corbyn movement had no organisational base within the Labour Party. When they got elected, it was basically Corbyn, McDonnell, and a couple of friends. They didn't have any allies and didn't do enough work earlier on to consolidate that control within the party. Whereas the staff bureaucracy, the regional offices and the councillor base, thousands and thousands of them, were hotbeds for the right of the party that hated everything about Corbyn's model of politics, particularly that you should democratise things, because that would threaten their entrenched positions, like their councillor allowances, the jobs for the senior staffers and so on. So they've been there since Blair and liked that model of politics. And, you know, that movement lost the last general election. There's lots of structural reasons for that that have been gone over in other places. But the fact that the right of the Labour Party was able to win it back so quickly is really astonishing. So all Starmer had to do was claim that he would implement a left-wing agenda, continue that left-wing agenda, despite the fact that his campaign was being run by known Labour right people, that those members that voted for Corbyn a couple of years before voted for Starmer simply because he said he'd do these things. And there were no structures or organised members networks or alternative medias to tell them otherwise that there was something going on here. And of course, you're operating within the billionaire media environment, and there's no other working class infrastructure to counter those narratives, so people become very drowned in that hegemony that we talked about at the start. And you know, if we think about the kind of strategy for radical change that we've talked about throughout this series, getting a democratic socialist elected was an attempt to do a revolution backwards, really. You win an election and then build all the working class infrastructure that's needed to ensure a transition away from capitalism. And it could have worked, but it would have been a long shot, and it was a shortcut. And normally you'd have to do it the other way around, because in order to get a fair hearing from enough people to win an election, you need that organisation on the ground to challenge the dominant narratives. So that's before elections. If you get elected to a council, for example, here's some things you should be thinking about, I think. So are you using that platform to raise ideas that are not otherwise heard? Are you using the time that you're paid for as a councillor, for example, to be building community infrastructure that is not just about keeping you in office, but is also about building a wider community power base around you, so that it's not just you in that chamber making the case for something, but you're a representative of this much broader community movement? And are you making your council structures more democratic? Are you trying to bring in things like participatory budgeting? Are you trying to transform people's ideas of themselves and their communities, rather than just saying, oh, we're the good politicians, you should vote for us and we'll just do it right? So if we're not on the verge of a revolution, how do we win? So I'm going to kind of end out here by giving you a few tools to understand the current crisis and what we do about it. So a really influential book for me in the last year or two was How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 20th century, that should say the 21st century, sorry, by, again, Eric Olin Wright, who died a couple of years ago now. But he came up with this model of understanding how we intervene in society, in how it relates to capitalist dynamics, and that any project or campaign that you're doing will usually fit into one of these four categories. So smashing capitalism is the very traditional revolutionary storming the Winter Palace conception of how revolution and how you can transition away from a capitalist system. So you're creating an irreversible rupture and disruption to everyday life and just changing everything overnight. And it's pretty clear that we don't have the conditions, as you guys said in the poll, to pull off something like that, both because of what we learned from Gramsci and also because of the broader structural weakness of working class organization. So in this book, he says you shouldn't really be doing that. Taming capitalism. Now, that is basically bringing in reforms that will mean that fewer parts of society are operating by capitalist logic. So you could do that by creating universalist public institutions that operate on the basis of care rather than profit. So the NHS, for example, where your interaction with that service, nothing to do with money, nothing to do with your ability to pay, it's just about being cared for. That's an example of taming capitalism. So you can, over time, tame capitalism by moving, by bringing in those reforms. Escaping capitalism is something that he's not very fond of, and I'm not of either. So that's things like you or a community of people going off to build a commune, or personally trying to escape from the dynamics of capitalism. But when we've got a climate to save, that's not really a viable thing. So, but it's a useful tool to go, is this project taming capitalism, eroding capitalism, or just escaping capitalism, for example? And then the final one, eroding capitalism, is where you're permanently replacing capitalist logic with a non-capitalist logic. So you might have a reform that makes it more, that reduces how profitable a corporation is, for example, but eroding capitalism is replacing parts of society that are dominated by capitalism with things that aren't. So if you take privatized land, for example, turn that into a commons where it just operates to completely different logics, that's eroding capitalism. So which of these best reflects some of the project campaigns or elections that you're involved in? I find this a really helpful framework for thinking about what interventions am I making, the groups that I'm involved in, what interventions are they making? And then the last thing to bring out really is this book called The Shock Doctrine of the Left. So some of you will have heard of this idea of the shock doctrine. It was actually an earlier book by Naomi Klein, which is developing the idea that the right and neoliberal revolutionaries in particular were using crises to impose really radical economic changes that would not be accepted in normal times. So what Graham Jones, the author of this book, did was really reverse this, to try and map out a strategy for the left to intervene in the system. So he adopted that previous model that I showed you a bit differently. So he said that you shouldn't rule out smashing capitalism, but he conceived of it slightly differently. He said that you're not going to just have a sudden revolution, but you can create shocks to the system that will just kind of just shake people up, make people think a bit differently. So the Extinction Rebellion shutting down London for 2 weeks a couple of years ago, that could be an example of smashing, in the sense that it creates shocks, that it dominates political debate and forces people onto those terms. So in this model, you can impose ever greater shocks on the status quo. So think Extinction Rebellion, but bigger and more varied. And then what you can do is you can absorb, new people will come to your movement or campaign as a result of doing these very dramatic smashing interventions. You can absorb those people and rapidly train them to become new activists, and then build greater shocks because you've trained those people up really quickly. He says that you could tame capitalism with reforms the fact that you're winning reforms, so even if you're not kind of getting socialist utopia tomorrow, the fact that you've won something shows that change is possible, and you can do that more and more of a time. People go, oh, actually, this isn't all set in stone, is it? Change is possible. That provides a helpful narrative point. And a very important contribution from Graham Jones, I think, is the idea of building a solidarity economy that supports everyone to take part. So that's things like, you know, childcare cooperatives, or kind of almost like cooperative talking therapies, I suppose, for people to get over their trauma within activist experiences, where you stop people from dropping out. You're continually building a bigger movement, and some people's role is to kind of nurture the people involved to make sure that they stay strong enough to stay involved. You know, provide people with meals or whatever, if that's what people need to stay involved. So 2 really interesting frameworks there that, if you're interested in this stuff, I would encourage you to check out. So I'm going to wind up now with some lessons to take away. So radical change needs a multifaceted strategy. That's been the whole point of this series, really. And you can obviously pick what you want to spend most of your time on, but you need to be aware of how all the different parts are interacting together. So how does whether the Green Party does well, how does that relate to whether tenant unions are big, and where do the trade unions come into that, and how do those reinforce each other or not? And what is considered common sense or hegemonic is shaped by what people do, and it can be changed. Extinction Rebellion had a very big success in that, in terms of massively changing the narrative about that, not so much the action, but what public opinion was. Building working class organizations at the local level that constantly brings in new people to struggle is essential to building the strengths to win. That's what we learned from the People Power session last time, and I think it's going to be really crucial to rebuilding working class organization in a way that allows us to really do away with the media dominance, for example, of the elites. So maybe think, is your action disrupting the profit-making process in some way? Is it symbolic, or are you stopping someone from making profit and thereby forcing them to the table to negotiate with you? So think in terms of material power whenever you can. And think about how the Green Party can use its work in communities to build class consciousness and robust local organisation. So that's what I'm going to leave you with. That's been a lot of stuff. Thank you so much for giving me all this time. I hope it's given you some of the tools you need to understand what's going on in this really disorientating world in some way, and really looking forward to seeing what questions people have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sam. Can we see a Zoom wave of applause? That was incredible, and really uplifting and exciting. I don't know if anybody else feels like it. It's like, aha, that's how we do it. That's how we challenge the system. Let's get going. I'm sure other people have all been writing millions of notes, as I have throughout that. So just huge thanks, Sam, for again, an incredible amount of information so accessibly put forward for us as well. And now is our chance to have a brief Q&A with you. And people have been sending in their questions, but you still can send your questions through to Jane. She's got questions here in brackets in her name through the chat. But I think I'll kick off with one maybe that brings us kind of like straight to now, or maybe like the big question on perhaps on everyone's minds is like thinking, Sam, about how and when we recognize such a large transformation of society is needed, when we think about the enormous kind of structures that essentially need dismantling if we're really going to see some kind of like real social environmental justice, is there a need for those really big trigger moments? We recognize that you kind of highlighted a load of really interesting moments in history in which like the contradictions of capitalism have created that pushback from like working class movements. And we've got a question here that just asks, do you think that kind of radical change, that kind of a revolutionary push may come off the back of the current crisis or the climate crisis or another kind of big kind of scale moment? Do you see any of those things happening now or possible in the future? It's quite a, I don't know, just tell the future for us, please, Sam. But yeah, there's quite an interesting question there about moments, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched upon this a little bit in previous sessions, and the fact that the pandemic is kind of a systemic crisis in some ways, and that it's challenging the very like basic assumptions, and that it's kind of pulling the curtain back a little bit on what people were told the way society had to be. And, you know, actually overnight rough sleeping was solved. The government was paying people's wages to stay at home. You know, things were possible that people were told were not possible. And, you know, I think there was at the beginning a really big sense, wasn't there, that there's some potential here for some really radical change. But then I think everyone got really kind of demobilized by how long it was going on for, how difficult it was to organize under these conditions. But, you know, I was just looking at the roadmap to reopen England a bit earlier, and, you know, we're not going back to normal, are we? Like, there's going to be some sort of restrictions for quite some time. And I think there's going to be a situation quite soon where we're much more able to do things that more resemble the types of organizing that we're used to, but where we still got these very crisis conditions where things are happening that people were told couldn't happen. And, you know, people will be questioning why has a pandemic of this size come up? Why have governments been so rubbish at dealing with it? Well, because they're serving the needs of capital before the needs of us, and I think that's been shown to more and more people, and more people being exposed to the benefits system, how mean it is, for example. So I think it has had a radicalizing factor. A lot of the independence movements in Wales and Scotland had a boost because of stuff that's going on with that as well. And, you know, climate change is only going to continue to generate more and more kind of revolutionary action and ferment. And actually, we can't compromise on this stuff. More and more people are going to be thinking that. Whether or not it's soon enough, and you know, there is no soon enough in a sense here, is there? And that, like, doing absolutely nothing is far worse than doing what the science says a little bit later than what we hoped to do, for example. That all has an impact. So yeah, climate change on its own is a big crisis that can generate a lot of that action, but it all depends on how we use that crisis and what we do with it, and whether we're analysing the situation with these sorts of principles, really, that decides whether has an impact, of course, on how well we can use these crises. So there's some good raw materials, lots of things that make it harder. But let's have a go.
Yeah, I like it. Let's have a go. That'll be a quote that people will be tweeting now. the big conclusion. Thanks so much, Sam. Yeah, that was really helpful, and I think it like links as well possibly to another question that we've got around kind of like radical action to transform the system. And one question that we've had come through is around sort of tactics, and we talked you talked earlier about kind of radical flank tactics and the impacts of some of these kind of organizations that have taken direct action in the past and social movements. And someone is asking, given the gravity of the situation, do you agree with more radical action to affect change, e.g. Extinction Rebellion, Greens Can, Burning Pink? And I was just going to add on this that I think that's perhaps like linking to what you were saying earlier about different framings of challenging capitalism and taming or eroding, or like I imagine, and I think I'm right in saying that like these three don't necessarily have a kind of anti-capitalist perspective to them. And I just wondered, yeah, maybe you could kind of respond to that question in relation to what we've been talking about like the types of what we mean by radical change and direct action, because sometimes those two things are kind of conflated. Yeah.
What were the other? I heard XR. I didn't hear the other two.
Sorry, Greens Can and Burning Pink. Burning Pink is the like follow-on from Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, the very same people who threw pink paint and broke into the Green Party head office not long ago.
I didn't hear about that, and I haven't heard of those folks. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think XR are very radical at all. They've got one main tactic, which, you know, in the context of the kind of like political debate that is normal, yeah, some people got upset about it, but it mostly had mass support because of the kind of rhetorical urgency of the thing. But you know, you could go so much further than this. Like that guy Andreas Malm that I was talking about earlier, when he talked about kind of subsistence emissions and luxury emissions, he put out a book quite recently called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And in it, he's making the case that, you know, in the global south, when people's livelihoods have been threatened by extraction, oil, or, you know, just the state violence that always comes with these sorts of extractive projects in those parts of the world, people have not hesitated to like blow up infrastructure or, you know, just sabotage in any way that you can. And, you know, it's less obvious in a lot of the north where those targets are, but it's certainly something. It's certainly a debate we should be having, you know, because we're looking at a lot of these. You know, XR looks at things like civil rights movement in America, and you know, actually mischaracterizes some of these movements as being completely non-violent in the sense that there was no property damage or anything. But we're now saying we've got to shut down an entire sector of capitalism forever, and we're going to get it with kind of less radical measures less radical tactics than what these folks were using. It doesn't sit quite right with me. So, you know, yeah, you've got to distinguish, haven't you, between what you might think of radical tactics and the radical demands. You know, Extinction Rebellion's demands are actually really not very. I don't think they're saying nationalize and shut down the fossil fuel economy in 7 years. Like,
yeah, maybe the school strike
as well. We really need to be hearing like people say, do this much more extreme thing, to use that radical flank effect to go, oh, actually we might do something about the climate emergency declaration.
Nice, I like that. Thanks so much, Sam. Yeah, radical demands as well as radical action. I think that's a really good message, and thing that we can think about as Greens. And actually, maybe I will move a little bit to. Oh, here's a nice question, actually. We've got a question in from someone who, at the very start of the lecture, we were talking about hegemony and how, and related back to the topic you mentioned about capital realism, the feeling that there are so many structures and spaces and institutions that play a role in creating the feeling that capitalism is good for us all. And one person has asked, well, what are the material ways that we can build an alternative hegemony? In essence, what can I do? This person asks.
Wow.
I like to throw the hard ones at you. Sorry.
I think it really depends where like your starting passions are. It can be something as simple as starting a tenants union where you live, or it can be trying to get your street involved in some local issue that has like a radicalizing potential. So, you know, I don't think things like pavement parking necessarily can lead you somewhere more radical, but if there's some like really controversial property development going on, for example, you can use that as a kind of radicalizing narrative to say our council is only working for these people who are profiting from it. They don't care about us, they don't care about the environment. And really using that campaign to build up this narrative that most of us don't have power, but we should do. And we actually aren't that divided on the basic material things that we want. So all I would say is that I think it has to be quite rooted in the local. I wouldn't necessarily have said that a few years ago, but as I've learned more and more about this stuff and tried to connect it all together, you know, we have no chance of people being able to go, oh, that thing that Boris Johnson said is nonsense, or what the Daily Mail said is nonsense, if you haven't got these like local networks of people that are talking these things out, that are educating each other, and that has to be done at a local level for most people. You know, so some of us are extremely online, but that's not going to be a majority pursuit. So using local projects, whatever you happen to already be passionate about that has a radicalizing potential to involve your community in, would be my suggestion for now.
Nice, thanks, Sam. And that links as well, like to hopefully what we'll be kind of continuing to move towards in our political education work and our activism as the Young Greens. Like, we're trying to put these things together, and hopefully, if you stick with us, we'll be creating options and opportunities to kind of help you have the tools to do that in your local community, or with us nationally, locally, in different scales. But the next thing actually that we have is really related. I don't know if there's any much more you'd like to add on this, Sam, but just exactly as you're saying, someone has just kind of written in saying, do we need to construct the kind of upward facing democracy described within the Green Party? Should we as a political organisation be facilitating hyper-local environmental activism, forming the foundation for a consolidated green movement to cascade up into regional, national and international forums? Quite a nice, interesting idea of scale.
Yes, And I think that's what's so cool about this social ecology idea, which is that it is an ideal about how you can organize a society that's a bit of a way off, but you can use the principles to apply to stuff you're doing in the here and now. And how activists where I live have been thinking about this is that, you know, we have a Kurdish diaspora here, and we've been very influenced by these ideas. But we're also kind of living in a part of the city where it's very diverse and feels very neglected by the kind of powers that be, that it's just people being left behind. There's all these big developments happening everywhere. No one's being consulted about it. And actually, we're thinking about trying to set up a community council, which is really rare in a city. But there's quite an easy legal loophole that we can go through to set that up. And then, depending about how we organize that, we can try and create a culture locally where, of course, Labour can't stand and take all these seats. That's not what this is about. This is about real community like deliberation and engagement. And we're going to amend, kind of have supplementary planning guidance that is based on, you know, really sound environmental and social principles, and just using that, you know, sub-state thing as a site to build real kind of decentralized democratic power. So, you know, I think in England you can also do that. You need like 150 people in a meeting to set up one of these things. So let me know if you want to talk about that. But yeah, that's absolutely what we should be doing, I think.
Really cool ideas, and thank you for so many of these questions are great, and I really want to try and answer as many of them as we can, but I'm struggling to know where to go next. But the next, I think the next couple of questions are going to put together, or maybe ask in a row, that I think are related to, I suppose, the challenges that come with the many challenges that come with trying to build a radical movement for change and deliver that kind of radical system change. And one of the questions that has come through is, what do you believe is the best way we can educate or support, or like, I guess, bring on board people who have been indoctrinated by far right ideas about the left and far right ideas in general? How can we challenge some of those kind of like hegemonic views that are particularly polarizing at the moment?
I think when we're talking about this sort of thing, we need to distinguish between kind of quite popular, nasty ideas like immigration, for example, that have quite wide purchase, and things that have grown over time, and this, you know, much smaller kind of online YouTube radicalization of young men sort of thing that is, you know, going to like full-on fascism very, very quickly. And, you know, the stuff I read about it says that you know, you have to be a certain type of person to really be pulled into that level of stuff. That yes, there's problems with like QAnon and the kind of growth of conspiracy theories more broadly in the situation of the pandemic and isolation and all this, but you know, Proud Boys are not the same thing as a lot of people having quite nasty views about immigrants, for example. But to me, like, this might sound about naive, but I think it's mostly about atomization and like working with people that are different to you, and working for a common purpose in your community, and being united in your differences. And there's a really, I don't know whether I ever mentioned this in a previous session, but there were some stories from kind of East London in the 30s, when it was about similar sort of time to when the British Union fascists were trying to march on Cable Street, and they were kept out by the community to protect the Jewish population. And in that area, there were you know, there was the odd person that was, I think, a member of the fascists, for example, and, you know, lost their job, or like got into trouble with their landlord, or had a really like worrying material problem suddenly come to them. And the Communist Party were really like active in this community to like really like bring community power to bear, to like almost like a tenants union, to just like support community members in this thing. And he wrote to, not Oswald Mosley, do I mean Mosley? Yeah. He wrote to Oswald Mosley about his plight, didn't get a reply. But he then went to kind of the local kind of communist organizer, who said, right, well, we'll help you out. Sort of this problem with the landlord or whatever it was, stopped him getting evicted. And yeah, that guy never did anything else with the fascists. So, you know, it is showing solidarity even when it's not the most comfortable thing to do, and working together with people, I think, that is the best tool we have to overcome that sort of bigotry.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Sam. Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's like a yeah, like the comment on atomization, I think, is like one to take home, definitely. An interesting like switch to the other side of the political scale. I've got a question that's around difficulties on the left, and the question is, how do we avoid constant infighting that we see between socialist groups if we're trying to build a broad-based kind of socialist movement? Which is I don't know if you want to comment, maybe help explain what they might mean by those like infightings, but I'm imagining that it means that the kind of like I guess, yeah, atomization or like splitting of various political parties, movements within the British left, perhaps, and yeah, how we can kind of bring those together.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could refer to the fact that, yeah, the left always wants to be not pure as such, but like very principled, and yeah, differences can cause big problems, whereas the right only cares about power, and they're quite class conscious in that sense, that the most important thing is being in power, because then we can do stuff, and might have our arguments in the background, but at the end of the day, everyone lines up. And I think, you know, there might be something to be said for this in terms of not trying to aim for unity of analysis or unity of values. So you're not saying like you know, if you're talking about a point when the British left was very weak, you might be talking about this Trotskyist party doesn't agree with this other Trotskyist party about the theory of revolution or something. But gladly we've come past that point now. But thinking more in terms of unity of action, so you might have different views on like what your end point is in the future, but given the relative strength of the left, we're not in a situation where, you know, a Leninist approach to taking power versus a social ecological view of power. It's not relevant in 2021, but all those groups can come together and say, right, there's this thing we want to fix right now, we can combine our forces to do that. So unity in action rather than unity in analysis or strategy is the best thing I can suggest for that.
Nice one, I like that. Okay, then I think I'm going to ask one final question that's more around kind of general conceptual understandings of how capitalism works, and then we've got a load of questions that bring us more towards green politics and the Green Party and how that sits within this, which I think is like been a really important part of this session and sort of where we're coming to a close, which is nice. So the next question we have is brilliant and it is big, so I'll send it your way, Sam. And it says, as people living in the imperial core or global north, our relationship with global capital and its most brutal and extractive elements is fundamentally different to that of people living in the south. Capital has shown in the past that it is quite comfortable striking bargains with sections of the working class, in particular those in the global north, in order to sustain itself in the face of attacks. Recognising that fact, how should that inform or affect our strategies and or tactics as anti-capitalists?
That's a great question. And it makes me think about something I came across recently, where I said earlier about how people's class position can be quite contradictory these days. And one example of that is where, you know, you're in the global north working in marketing to generate loads of profit for a clothing brand, for example. You're getting paid an all right wage, but you're generating huge amounts of profit on the back of like horrific exploitation of, you know, garment workers in the global south, for example. So yeah, this is complicated, isn't it? I think doing as much as we can to hear more about what's going on in the south is the best thing we can do there, really. So there are certain people and organizations like Warren Want and, you know, people like Assad Rehman who are really great in how they censor everything they say about politics within, you know, what's actually going on in the global south and how capitalism is affecting people there. So check out people like them. But, you know, a good issue and campaign to be involved in at the moment on this, I think, is probably the kind of vaccine stuff and the whole there's groups like Global Justice Now are saying stop vaccine nationalism, get rid of the patents, and I find it pretty astonishing how there's very few people actually saying just get rid of the patents, give the recipe to everyone. But we're not insular. You know, if you're living in, say, Senegal, that's like a day-to-day life and death. You know, why the fuck isn't this happening? But here, you don't think about that sort of thing. Then you go, oh well, everyone here is getting the vaccine at some point, so it's all fine. So that's the way we're blind to these things. So yeah, just do as much as we can to pay attention to what struggles are going on in the South, and ask for, on things like climate change, ask to be led by movements in the global South, and how our action and money can help with that.
Great, yeah, really nice response. Thanks so much, Sam. And I think actually the Green Party ran an online panel discussion on tackling that kind of vaccine nationalism, and that's an online recording you can go and see as well, with I think Just Treatment and a few other speakers as well. So it's cool that the party is trying to, wider party as well as ourselves, trying to kind of pull that into the limelight. I was excited to see that one. Cool, then thank you. Then I think we'll move to our final few questions, which are a little bit more about the green politics and where this sits and what this all means for the Green Party. The first question that I have then, in which case, actually I'll put two together because I think they kind of touch on similar points. The first one is, sometimes in the Green Party we hear people say, oh, we're not left or right wing, we're green. Why do you think this is? How can we challenge arguments that essentially depoliticize our politics, or narratives maybe? And then the second one is, similarly, we hear arguments that to avoid scaring centrists, it would be wise to, for those seeking radical change necessary to tackle climate change, etc., to be more about managed capitalism. And do you think this argument has some weight in the current political landscape? Are those okay together?
Yeah. You don't hear so much of the not left or right but ahead thing anymore. You heard it a fair bit when I was first knocking around the Greens. And, you know, it's environmentalism. It's not a term I like using very much these days, but, you know, that didn't necessarily have its roots in left-wing politics. It had many different kind of outcrops from the kind of 19th century onwards. You had very kind of nationalistic, very racist kind of people associated with some of these defending the natural world from these savages type things that have been going on, you know, for quite some time. And people like Prince Charles and, you know, unfortunately people like David Attenborough are still kind of entertaining some of these ideas. And the actual roots of the Green Party, if you go right back, are with disaffected Tories that thought that they weren't doing enough on this issue. So yeah, if you're not clear about, actually there's 100 companies that are responsible for almost all historical emissions, and it's those executives that are responsible and need to clean this up, then there's no debate about whether that's a right or a left-wing thing. It's about how you frame these issues. If you're saying, you know, most of us are forced to live this way because of the power that a few people have and the power that we don't have, then class consciousness becomes a natural thing there, doesn't it? So yeah, I think it still persists a little bit because of kind of the fact that, you know, environmentalism as a term kind of exists on all sides of politics and is used for different reasons. But we have a universalist idea of it, that is, we want to protect the natural world. We think that all people across the world have equal rights to things, and that has to then mean left-wing politics. What was the second part of the question? Second question?
It was a question about using managed capitalism rather, so not to scare people in the centre.
I think that might well end up being the approach we have to take in the short term. Not necessarily like rhetorically appealing to people like that, but it being the tools that are actually used. So we have to use those radical flanks by saying we need to nationalize and shut down the fossil capital sector within a handful of years. That then makes anything to the right of that seem more reasonable. But you know, we're not going to have. I don't think we're going to have a revolution in the next year or two. So we're going to have to try out whatever works. So I don't think we should compromise like rhetorically or in terms of what we're calling for, but we have to accept that things might happen in a different way to what we're saying. So it's kind of recognizing there is a difference between saying, you know, the state must do this and shut this down now, when, you know, we don't have the power to enforce action on the state yet, but saying that is still a radicalizing factor and makes it more likely that we will get something approaching that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, nice one. Thanks so much, Sam. That was great. I think, I want to squeeze in these three. Maybe I can ask you to do there was one more that came in on the Labour Party in particular, and I thought it might just be nice to kind of add that in, because you did speak earlier about, yeah, like cautionary warnings after Corbynism. And one question that has come in is, to what extent do you think the Labour Party is taking up an eco-socialist or social ecology stance with the growth of Labour for a Green New Deal, etc.? Is this perspective as embedded as it is in the Greens? Should we be trying to make them take this stance? Where do you think it's all heading? Yeah.
I think the Labour for Green New Deal people are really, really upset about the shift that the Labour's taken since Starmer, and yeah, they're right to be. But I've been really impressed with the stuff they were putting out and the narratives they were using for it. And if you like read their stuff, it kind of almost shows the ways in which the Greens have sometimes been deficient in the way that they're talking about these things like, you know, co-producing climate solutions with workers, and making sure that the poor are not left behind and things, and we're not going to have things like French eco taxes that punish the wrong people and so on. So I think it would be, you know, eco-socialism used to be used in the Green Party as a way of kind of saying, well, we're more left-wing than the deep ecologists, which is not, don't get the impression that deep ecologists are a huge tendency anymore. But that was very much the kind of like not left, not right, but ahead thing, that it's not actually enough to deal with what we're talking about. But I think the Greens could do very well from taking some of the stuff Labour for Green New Deal has been doing and trying to develop a similar program within the Greens to say, you know, we're going to do this really radical thing. We're not going to do carbon taxes. We're going to tackle the problem at its root, for example, and make it very unambiguous. Like if you try and say that sorting out the climate is bad for workers, you just make it completely untenable a position by the way you're talking about these things.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know that we've gone over time, and I'm so sorry. So I've got one final question that might have to be a brief one for you, Sam, but I think a nice way to round up. And the question is there one key lesson or theme from this series of lectures that you think is most important for Greens to take on board at the moment?
Oh.
Hard one.
I should have that prepared, shouldn't I?
Sorry. Or settle.
Power.
Nice.
We're not, you know, the problem that our movement has had from the 90s onwards was not being involved in radical social movements and the broader working class movement, moving into NGOs and lobbying and hoping that having cups of tea with Gordon Brown was going to solve things. And that was never going to, for the reasons that we've gone through. So always think about power, think about what people's interests are in a given situation, and yeah, don't be fooled by people that say nice things, like my Labour MP that said she worked in the environment but stabbed Corbyn in the back. That's no environmentalist that wants to demobilise a democratic socialist movement.
Wonderful, thank you so much. If you are still with us, thank you for joining. Could we have a massive final round of applause for Sam? That was, as always, incredible. That's awkward as like what, 2 claps, but I can see, there we go, the emojis are starting. Thank you so much. It's been incredible. Please don't leave yet though, because there's a few things to throw your way that are also really important. But in general, we would just want to thank you all especially for joining us, but a huge thanks also to Sam for running these 4 incredible lectures over the last month. It has been so much information to take in, but at such an important time for us to be talking about these kind of really broad ideas. And from the start of this, when we kind of approached Sam, we were looking at our kind of former series of talks and we were trying to think, at the time we were looking at the current crisis and thinking, right, we need to start thinking big about how we can challenge the big problems that, like, coronavirus is really illustrating to us how neoliberal capitalism has failed. And so how do we start to fight back and think about how we tackle the real, like, root causes of the problem? And we started to realize that actually there's so much to learn and think about. If we're really going to, like, start envisioning an alternative or start planning a political strategy for real radical change, we really need to understand ourselves. How did we get here? What are these structures? How has all this come about? And I think, Sam, what you've delivered for us has been incredible, and hopefully just that for all of you at home too. So if you missed the start or the end, or you're watching this on YouTube, Sam will also be giving a list of further readings, to online films, videos, explainers, podcasts, I think even mentioned, so that you can delve into all of these issues a lot more deeply. But also, moving on from this, our next stage of this political education programme is to dive deep into the issues that matter most to young people at the moment, that matter most in society at the moment. And we're going to be bringing this perspective, this analytical lens about how society is structured, into looking at very specific issues, from migration to aviation, the aviation industry, to supply chain justice, to education, a whole list of things that we know are we're struggling with right now, and we need to see change. And these are going to be online talks and Q&As with a host of special guests, from activists, campaigners, to policy experts, etc., as I mentioned at the start. And we'd love for you to join us at those. But the first thing I wanted to say actually is that before I start sending you those links, there are many people here. In fact, would you like anyone, I haven't opened the chat so you can't guess, but you can guess in your mind how many people have signed up to this radical lecture series. Nearly 800 people have registered for this series, so we are sending all these all this information to people. We've had over 100 people come on each week, and this one got slightly moved around, so we expected smaller numbers, but generally it's a huge number of people are getting excited. But also there are maybe many of you here that aren't members of the Green Party and are just interested in learning. So if you aren't, but you would like to join and get more involved and be a part of this growing movement and our growing green politics, then you can join for just £3 a month, or if you're a student, even less. I think it's £6 a year, so very, very cheap, and please do join. Now is the time, I guess. And the second thing to say is that as I mentioned at the very start, we have had some funding to deliver this series of lectures, which has been incredible, but we would love to do more of this again. And moving forward, that does mean that we require and exist upon very small regular donations from people like you. So if you've loved this, you've loved what we've done, you want to see more of Sam and others, please do follow this next link that I've put in the chat. That is a small, that links you to where you can make a small regular donation, which means we can do more of this, build bigger, and hopefully see more of you soon. But as I said, the third thing on my list, I promise you there are only 5. When you get in there, 3. Oh no, there are only 4. There you go. The next thing is our next event. I know you can't wait to sit on Zoom for another hour. So the next event is Wednesday this week. It's with rent strikers from across the country, from LSE, from Sheffield, Hallam, on Students Are Not Cash Cows, building solidarity with the rent strikers. Why has our education system is so screwed? What has marketisation done to our education, and how do we fight back? And we're going to be hearing from the student rent strikers on how they're not only facing immediate challenges in the pandemic, but also on a broader scale as well, and talking about how we transform our education. And then the next thing that would be fantastic is if you could help share this event, which is I'm going to now put in a small link that is a click to tweet. So if you follow that link, it will send you to Twitter, where you can where a pre-filled tweet will appear, and it will share that you had loads of fun at this event. It was amazing. Well done, Sam. And go along to the next event, which is on Wednesday at 8 p.m. a new time. They'll be running weekly, almost weekly from now on. But I promise you that is my final link and my final plea. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And huge thanks again, Sam. And we hope to all see you in a couple of days or following weeks. But yeah, cheers and round of applause and cheerio. Enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.